Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your interest in this very important topic. My name is Renee Savoy, and I work for the Connecticut State Department of Education and have served as the NAEP State Coordinator for more than 15 years. Today, I'll be moderating our Q&A session after the presentation. Please be sure to enter your questions in the chat space so that we can address those thoughts and concerns before the end of our time together this afternoon. We're about to hear from Dr. Kelly Cartwright. Dr. Cartwright is a professor of psychology, neuroscience, and teacher preparation at Christopher Newport University, where she directs the Reading Executive Function and Development Lab, or READ Lab, and serves as a research scholar for the Center for Education Research and Policy. Kelly's work explores the development of skilled reading comprehension and the neurocognitive and affective factors that underlie comprehension processes and difficulties from preschool through adulthood. Her research has been supported by grants from the Virginia State Reading Association as well as IES. Kelly regularly works with teachers in public and private schools throughout the U.S. to better understand and improve reading comprehension for struggling readers, and it's these experiences that inform her research. Today's presentation, which has been pre-recorded, is titled Students with Reading Comprehension Difficulties, Identification and Support. When the presentation is complete, I'll join you live for the Q&A component of our session. Now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cartwright.
Hello, my name is Kelly Cartwright, and I'm a professor at Christopher Newport University in psychology, neuroscience, and teacher education. And today I'm going to be talking with you about identifying and supporting students with reading comprehension difficulties. The scientific evidence on reading is clear. Reading comprehension is incredibly complex and involves a number of different processes. The magnitude of this complexity is represented here with this iceberg, and you'll see why in a moment. Now, we see evidence on the surface in our students' behavior of some of these processes in things like phonemic awareness, phonics knowledge, decoding and word recognition processes, fluency, vocabulary breadth, how many words they know, but also depth, how much they know about each word, and in their oral language comprehension, understanding what is said and read to them, and in strategic knowledge, things like inferring and predicting and so forth. Now, certainly, if a child has word reading difficulties, reading comprehension is going to be undermined. It's going to break down because if you can't pull the words off of the page, you can't understand what those words mean. The evidence says that we must systematically and explicitly teach word recognition processes. But even when we do, word recognition doesn't guarantee reading comprehension. And I'm going to share some data from my home state of Virginia as an example to illustrate this point. In Virginia, we have an early intervention reading initiative, and that initiative is designed to assess components of word recognition all the way from the fall of kindergarten through third grade, and then intervene when necessary to make sure that our students can read words by third grade. Okay, so the assumption behind this intervention is that if students can read the words, then comprehension will just naturally follow based on their already existing language comprehension skills. But our NAEP data tell a different story. And the 2019 NAEP data for fourth grade show that 62% of Virginia's fourth graders cannot comprehend text at a proficient level, and 31% are below basic. And we see a similar pattern across the nation. And these data give us this key insight that just like word recognition, reading comprehension doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't just naturally follow skilled word reading. It's got to be taught explicitly. In other words, going back to this slide, even if all of these skills seem to be in place, reading comprehension still looks like this for some of our students. And these kinds of data have led researchers and teachers and parents to ask the question, what is going on beneath the surface? it seems like something is going on, or perhaps it's not going on, that's wrecking their comprehension ships, if you will. And so today, we're going to turn our attention to the scientific evidence on students with specific reading comprehension difficulties. We will talk about who these students are, how we can identify them, how many there are, and we'll discuss their characteristics and difficulties so that we can better understand how to support their reading comprehension in the classroom. All right, so who are these students? Well, we know they show a surprising mismatch between word reading and reading comprehension. Now, they have really strong word reading skills and surprisingly poor reading comprehension. And researchers say they have reading comprehension deficits or specific reading comprehension difficulties, or they just call them poor comprehenders. Teachers tend to call these students word callers because they call out words from a page or read words from a page with no apparent understanding of what those words mean. Now, in practice, these students look great. They look like strong readers. They sound good. They seem fluent. They have strong word reading skills, and their reading level is on or above grade level. But keep in mind, we tend to assess reading level with word reading ability. So when we take a look at comprehension and we ask them about what they read, we find that they've got trouble with retelling and post-reading questions. They don't make inferences from what they read, and they seem to have a very inflexible focus on word reading processes. And they just don't even consider meaning. It's as though they can't shift their attention from decoding processes to meaning. Now, in terms of long-term prognosis, these kids grow up into adult poor comprehenders who are at risk of low educational and occupational attainment, and also at risk for long-term poor health outcomes. And so addressing these students' needs is a pressing national concern. So to identify these students, we need to take a look at their reading data on word reading abilities, but also on reading comprehension. And in what we'll do is we'll compare across these data to look for patterns in students' reading behavior. Now, in this chart, you see students in the fall of third grade. And in the first column, we have reading rate in words correct per minute. Now, in the fall of third grade, we would expect an average student to be reading at about a rate of 83 words correct per minute. Now, in the next two columns, you see word reading and reading comprehension scores in grade equivalent units. So second grade, 2.1 means second grade, 1 month. This student has word reading abilities at the level of a second grader in the first month of school. Okay. So looking across these data to identify poor comprehenders, we might see that students like Andrew and Sarah have this surprising mismatch between strong word reading and rate skills here, and then their reading comprehension, which is about a year behind. Now, you're probably looking at Charles too, up on this first row. Charles clearly has word reading difficulties. His rate is really slow for his age, and his reading comprehension is likely impacted by these difficulties he's having with word reading. Charles's data indicate that he needs additional doses of systematic explicit word recognition instruction over and above what he's already getting in the regular classroom instruction. So, what is it that we need to do to address the needs of Andrew and Sarah? That's where we're going next, okay? How many students like Andrew and Sarah might we find in our classrooms? Well, just like we did on the previous slide, researchers have compared across various reading skills to find profiles of reading difficulties. And across grade levels, across decades, and across countries, we find consistently that about 20 to 30% of struggling readers fit that poor comprehender profile with strong word reading abilities and surprisingly poor reading comprehension. Now, to understand these students' difficulties and close NAEP reading achievement gaps, we need to take a more nuanced view of reading informed by recent science. Typically, the simple view of reading and its sister model, the rote model, are what we have tended to use to explain and understand reading difficulties. So, knowing that word reading is not the problem for these students, these models would point to language comprehension and say they need language comprehension interventions to bring them up to speed on reading comprehension. But recent science suggests that the picture is more complex than that. Evidence shows that word reading and language comprehension actually overlap with one another and interact with one another. And so we can't just write the word recognition processes out of the picture. And not only that, but active self-regulation also plays a key role in driving word recognition, language comprehension, and helping readers coordinate the two. So even when we eliminate word recognition as a cause of these students' comprehension problems, this active view of reading points to additional considerations for understanding these students' difficulties and intervening to help them comprehend text better. So this active view would lead us to ask ourselves questions like, do they have the language knowledge and skills that they need to understand a text? And that's what we would ask if we were looking at the simple view or the rote model. But this active view also leads us to ask, can they coordinate their word reading and language comprehension processes? Can they coordinate and integrate those? And not only that, do they have the self-regulation skills needed to manage all of these aspects of reading at the same time? Okay, so going back to this slide, one key set of skills beneath the surface that drives word recognition and language comprehension and helps us coordinate these processes is executive functions. Executive functions are mental skills that we use to manage our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to achieve goals, from any goal, from grocery shopping to doing homework to managing a complex reading comprehension task. And in reading, this is a critical set of mental skills that enable us to manage all of those many reading processes toward that end goal of reading comprehension. Reading executive functions help us make decoding and language comprehension happen, and also work through the overlap between them to help readers coordinate and integrate them in service of comprehension. And in fact, specific executive functions underlie successful reading comprehension. Things like planning, which involves strategic goal-directed behavior, and organization, which is recognizing and using structure. Cognitive flexibility, which is switching between and coordinating various processes or aspects of a task. Inhibition, which involves resisting impulses or distractions and thinking before acting. And then working memory, holding information in mind, like a text's meaning, while carrying out an activity or process, like decoding or updating that text's meaning as we go along. Now, importantly, students with specific reading comprehension difficulties, they showed significant weaknesses in all of these executive function processes. So that's an important consideration for these students. Executive function skills drive, support, and coordinate the skills needed for reading comprehension. You can think about these as like the glue that holds reading processes together and helps readers to do all of these things at once. But when executive functions are weak, everything falls apart. So understanding how to support students with reading comprehension deficits means understanding how those executive functions and how those weaknesses, I should say, play out in language and reading tasks. Taking that simple approach of just focusing on language comprehension interventions means that we miss opportunities to support and address those underlying executive function weaknesses that we see in these students. So what are these students' characteristics? Well, they have trouble with planning and goal-directed reading, things like making and maintaining reading goals and plans, monitoring understanding, using strategies to regulate and repair comprehension. They have trouble with organization, recognizing and using the structure of language, whether it's story structure, expository text structure, sentence structure, or internal structure of words. They have trouble with cognitive flexibility, flexibly coordinating and using word sounds, meanings, spellings, and managing those and integrating those in service of comprehension. They also have trouble with inhibition, suppressing or ignoring distracting information. And they have trouble with working memory, holding text parts in mind to work on building meaning while also reading the words. Things like inferring meaning from context, which requires that you hold that word in mind and go back and check the context, or making inferences while listening and while reading. They have trouble with both. And resolving ambiguities in text, like resolving pronoun references. So explicit or excellent instruction for these students involves explicit explanation of those invisible mental processes. Remember, reading comprehension processes are invisible to students. They can't see how comprehension happens. So we have to do things like behavioral and mental modeling. We have to show them the processes, but we also have to make that thinking visible by saying it out loud. Okay, we have to do shared use of a strategy or skill that we're teaching so that we're walking alongside them and working alongside them, provide opportunities for guided, supported practice, and then provide opportunities for independent practice. And for students with reading comprehension difficulties, excellent instruction also attends to those underlying weak executive skills, providing concrete supports that you'll see as we finish our discussion today to build and strengthen those executive skills that make those reading processes happen. All right, so let's talk about supporting planning. Supporting planning requires that we, again, make that invisible comprehension process visible to students while providing a concrete support. Planning in reading involves many things that we know successful readers do. It involves setting goals and then teaching students steps they can take to reach their reading goals for particular texts. It also involves explicit explanation of the planning process to make that plan visible with concrete tools. So I might say to students, good readers are good planners. They know why they're reading and they make a plan to get there. And your plan to understand might look something like this. You might provide this tool to a student and help them to set a goal, make it visible, and then provide them steps to work through to reach that goal. Research evidence supports each of these steps. And importantly, when planning is made explicit in this way, poor comprehenders' reading comprehension improves. So they preview the text. They pay attention, figure out, should I pay attention to some parts and slow down for others? How do I connect my prior knowledge to this text? What goal-oriented questions can I ask myself? What do I predict will be in this text? And then what other steps can I take to reach my goal? Maybe I need to fill out a graphic organizer, take notes, or imagine, visualize what's happening in the text, and then identify what will I know when I'm done, okay? So again, a concrete support like this makes their weak planning abilities stronger and supports their reading comprehension in a more explicit way. Now, in terms of organization, students with reading comprehension difficulties also have trouble with syntax. Syntax is the way language is organized to make meaning. And students with comprehension difficulties have a really hard time organizing these types of scrambled sentences in ways that make sense. So you probably see, I like dogs, cats have fur, I ride the bus to school. These sentences jump out at you. But for a student with reading comprehension difficulties, that doesn't happen as easily because they have weak organizational skills. They have a hard time organizing language in this way. We can support that ability by providing explicit instruction and concrete support. First, we teach students to look for the action word. The action word is like a pivot point in the sentence. And then we teach them to arrange all of the other words around that word. Who did it goes before the action word, and so on. And by answering these prompt questions that help them to organize the words around the action word, they have a concrete strategy for understanding the internal structure of that sentence. And when poor comprehenders are taught in this way, their reading comprehension improves. Now, another way organization underlies reading comprehension is in text structure. And if you think about stories, stories are organized in cause and effect ways. Events are connected because of cause and effect. So think about the little engine that could. In that story, the train's engine breaks down, and so the toys are sad. And the toys, because they're sad, they decide they're going to do something about it. So they ask a bunch of different engines for help. And because they do that, one of the engines says yes and actually pulls them over the mountain and solves the problem. And then their reaction to that solution is that they are happy at the end. So children with reading comprehension deficits struggle with understanding cause and effect in stories. And their retellings are actually like a string of unrelated events. They just say and. So we can use story maps with prompts like these to make those connections between story events visible and provide that concrete support to shore up their weak organizational skills and weak working memory to help them keep those things in mind and connect them together. When students with reading comprehension difficulties are taught in this way, their reading comprehension improves. Now, I want to say a little bit more about those connectives. So here's a sentence: Sharon got wet, blank, she forgot her umbrella. Now, if you were a student with reading comprehension difficulties, you would probably put the word and in that blank. They tend to only use simple additive connectives. You probably understood that causal relation. You held those two pieces in mind, thought about the relation between them, and then stuck because in that blank. So we need to work on supporting those actual connectives, those connecting words. We can also use them to assess our students because their use of connecting words tells us a lot about their understanding of the causal relations in stories. So we can provide pictures that they have to put into story sequences, or sentences that they put into a sequence. And then they narrate for us, what is that story? And we can track their connectives in the story retellings. We can have them narrate wordless picture books in the same way. And we can have them write narratives and look for those causal connection words. We can also explicitly teach those words that represent independence between ideas, dependence between ideas, and time sequence. And knowledge of those connecting words will help support their understanding of those causal connections in stories. So one other way that organization skills relate to reading comprehension is in recognition and use of expository text structures. In contrast to stories, which have one kind of structure, it's always that cause and effect, same kind of story map. These expository text structures come in a lot of varieties. And you can see here, I've depicted 6 varieties of text structures for expository texts. We can provide a rubric like this visual support so that students begin to understand how to visualize the different kinds of text structures they might see in an expository text. When we teach these one at a time, and then gradually help them learn to integrate them and pair them and recognize different structures that might even appear within the same text. When we teach this text structure explicitly in this way, their reading comprehension improves, not only on expository text, but it even transfers to narrative text. So, what about flexibility? Flexibility, we recall that these children are really inflexible. They tend to have tunnel vision and focus only on decoding processes without paying attention to meaning. And this graphophonological semantic cognitive flexibility task, this is a long word, just means something simple. Graphophonological is the letter sound information. So that S goes with S and B goes with B, right? And semantic is meaning, okay? This task requires that students sort words by initial sound and meaning. So these words, these 12 words, are sorted by initial sound, s and b, and by meaning. These are clothing pieces, right? And these are cleaning supplies over on the other side. So this task shows us how well readers can coordinate those word recognition and language comprehension processes, the letter sound information and meaning. And this skill contributes across the lifespan to skilled reading comprehension, even in older adults, from early elementary school all the way through older adulthood. But people with reading comprehension deficits, children and adults, are significantly lower than their peers with skilled comprehension on this skill. They're not good at flexibly coordinating letter sound information and meaning. So the good thing is that we can improve this kind of flexibility. We can teach it, and the teaching of this kind of flexibility looks like this. First, we take the set of cards and we have them sort along one dimension. So here they've sorted along the meaning dimension. All the cleaning supplies are here. All the clothing items are here. Then they put the cards together and they sort again, but this time they sort into their letter sound groups. So here they've got the b words, and here they've got the s words. And then we put them all back together and we put 3 cards sorted by sound and meaning in the 2x2 matrix, in the little quadrants, and we leave one blank. And we ask the student which word goes here. To complete that blank successfully, they have to know not just what it sounds like, but also what it needs to mean, because these are cleaning supplies at the bottom. So clothing is at the top. The s words are over here. So the b words have to be over here. So it needs to be a piece of clothing that starts with b, like boots, blouse, belt, bonnet. Okay. We do this with them repeatedly until they get 4 in a row correct. And then the lesson is over. When this intervention occurs across 5 days with 5 different sets of words, always getting to that 4 in a row criterion, the cognitive flexibility of these students improves, but also their reading comprehension. So we can improve their flexibility to improve their attention to meaning in addition to letter and sound information. So how do we support inhibition? This is a toughie because if they're inhibiting things, we don't see behaviors, right? But one important way that inhibition comes into play in reading comprehension is when words have multiple meanings. And many times we expect students to learn or to know academic meanings for words for which they've already got a meaning. They know a common everyday meaning, and that one is strong and comes to mind quickly. But the new academic meaning may not come to mind quickly. So they have to inhibit the common everyday meaning and pay attention to the more specialized academic meaning. Think about these examples. The word sentence in language arts versus math class. It means something different. The word sum in math or in everyday language. Now, they're not spelled the same, but that doesn't matter when you're listening. So if I say, hey, can I have some of your cookies? That means part. But if I say, hey, if you have 3 cookies on your plate and 2 cookies in your lunchbox, what is the sum of your cookies? In both cases, I've said sum of your cookies, but in one it means part, and in the other it means the grand total. So we have to keep this in mind. Students have a hard time, students with reading comprehension deficits have a really hard time inhibiting their everyday meanings and picking the right meaning. And so intervention involves explicitly teaching students multiple meanings for words, phrases, and sentences, and then having them work with those meanings, because strengthening both meanings means that it makes it easier to inhibit the incorrect one when they're working with words in academic settings. So one especially effective activity is to have students create riddles based on lexical ambiguity, like this one. What did the dinosaur say when he ate a clown? That tasted funny. Now, to understand the humor in this little riddle, you have to understand that funny can mean humorous, but funny can also mean weird. And so to understand both of those meanings, enables you to understand the humor. We see in many, many children's books play on this kind of lexical ambiguity or meaning ambiguity, like Amelia Bedelia and all of the mistakes that she always made. But we can use these texts to teach this kind of multiple meaning thinking and choosing the right meaning for the context. Okay, so what about working memory? Let's turn our attention there. One way working memory is taxed in reading is in resolving anaphors. Now, anaphors are simple. It just means that authors use shortcuts. And this is how I would explain it to students. Authors use shortcuts when they write. They substitute shorter words or phrases for longer bits of text. And we've got to figure out what they mean. So that requires that you've got to hold some words in your mind and use them later to figure out what those small words mean. Now, let's take a look at this one. Sally loves to go to the park with Jane because she always pushes her very high on the swings. Now, to solve this, you probably make a mental image. You're thinking of Sally and Jane. Sally's on the swing. Jane is pushing her. So, her, that's Sally. And she, well, that's Jane. And you know that because you saw this mental picture. Well, students with reading comprehension deficits don't do this. They don't picture it. They don't have that mental image, and they have a hard time connecting the pronoun with its referent, okay? So highlighting in the text the pronoun and the referent is one way to do concrete scaffolding of this working memory process. But another way to do this is to have them create mental images before they try to make these connections. What's your image? Tell me what it looks like. Interventions that require that they make those mental images first enables them to resolve those pronouns more accurately and improves their reading comprehension. So imagery plus highlighting those specific connections in that text. So one last way that working memory, well, there are many, but today, the last way we'll discuss that working memory is also coming into play in reading comprehension is in inference making. So in this tiny story, it was 8:55 and the school bell rings at 9. Andy was pedaling as fast as he could because he was afraid that he might miss his test. In that story, where was he going? And you probably are thinking he's going to school, and you've made a text connecting local coherence inference by answering that question. And how was he getting there? Well, you probably have filled in that gap with your knowledge about things that are pedaled. You might have thought of a bike. Could be a tricycle, could be a unicycle, could be a paddle boat or a big wheel, but you probably filled it in with a bike. So to help students with poor comprehension who don't make these inferences, we need to provide concrete, visible supports for the inference making process. Inference maps scaffold those weak working memory skills. And here, let's map that previous inference, okay? You've got a couple of pieces of text that are there that you connected up, right? And you connected those to realize, okay, he's going to school. But you also supplied some missing information from your head. All of this is invisible to students unless we make it visible with a concrete support. What's missing? The bicycle or big wheel or paddle boat or whatever you filled in that blank with. Explicitly teaching inference making in this way, making it concrete and visible, supports their underlying working memory skills, and it improves reading comprehension for students with reading comprehension difficulties. So let's take a moment to summarize the interventions we've discussed today. We've talked about helping students with comprehension difficulties have a more planful, explicitly goal-directed approach to reading, helping them have more explicit attention to language and text organization and structure with concrete supports for that understanding. We've talked about helping them have a more flexible focus on meaning in addition to word sounds and the ability to shift in between them with that cognitive flexibility task. We've also talked about helping them have the ability to consider multiple word meanings and inhibit meanings that are not appropriate for the context. And then finally, we've talked about the ability to resolve pronouns and make inferences by using concrete supports for their weak working memory skills. skills. So what are some key takeaways of today's presentation? Well, number one, students with specific reading comprehension difficulties have problems that extend beyond just language comprehension. They are also weak in executive functioning skills. And those executive function weaknesses, they underlie these students' difficulties with language and with reading processes. So instruction for these students must be grounded in these principles. It's got to be explicit about the thinking involved in reading. We've got to help them find and see those invisible thinking processes that are not at all apparent to them. And not only that, we've got to be intentional about providing concrete supports that scaffold and support and bolster those weak executive skills for students with reading comprehension difficulties. Because as you saw today, those executive skills underlie specific comprehension processes that every skilled comprehender needs. I have a number of resources for you in the folders, and you can find my website there. Feel free to email or find me on Twitter with questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Cartwright. I really enjoyed it. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box, but I'm encouraging everyone, if you have questions or comments, thoughts you want to share, please type those in. In the meantime, I'll get us started with a question or two of my own. So you discussed several interventions designed to support students who have trouble with reading comprehension. Would those be helpful with students who also struggle with word reading in addition to reading comprehension?
That's a great question. Students who have word reading difficulties, think back to the slide with data. We looked at data on specific students. That top student on that slide was Charles, and he had a really slow reading rate, and he had significant difficulties with word reading skills. And for those students, for students who have reading comprehension problems alongside word reading difficulties, it's highly likely that their reading comprehension problems may be the result of those word reading difficulties. So for those students, what I would try first is additional explicit systematic word recognition instruction, because clearly they're not where they should be with those skills. And it may be that addresses their comprehension weaknesses. I mean, if they're just slightly undergrade level on word recognition skills, it may be that they also need support with these underlying reading comprehension skills.
I'm glad you brought up that table with the students' names, because that was really helpful for me in understanding your talk in general. And it's a great complement to what we saw yesterday in Dr. Carr's presentation, when she really tried to better describe for us who our struggling readers are. And we talked a lot about demographics and percentages, and the fact that you were saying 20 to 30% of our struggling reading comprehenders may actually fit into sort of the description that you had of Andrew and Sarah in that table. And to me, that was really kind of put a little more detail on that initial introduction yesterday. So I thought that was really helpful to me. Thank you for that. Still looking at the chat box, nothing yet, but we can throw another one out there.
Well, wait, I wanted to comment on what you said, if you don't mind, because I think that's a really great point, that all struggling readers are not the same. And so you may have a student who is scoring below proficient or below basic on the NAEP, but it might be word reading difficulty. It might be fluency. It might be that their executive skills aren't helping them weave together all of the processes necessary for comprehension. And if we don't disaggregate their data, if we don't at a school level look at all of their different reading scores and see where those patterns are, and we treat them all the same, we're not going to be able to effectively address their difficulties. All below proficient readers aren't the same. And so we need to start unpacking who those children are to be able to meet their needs.
That's a great point. Thank you. We do have a question from Mohammed. How can a teacher make a balance between working on executive functioning skills and working on the text itself?
That's a great question. And I would say when we're teaching reading with the text. Comprehension happens with the text. So the inference example I gave, for example, if I were a teacher working with a student who I knew had this difficulty, I would select text specifically to help address these inference weaknesses the child has, and then provide those concrete supports for those executive functioning skills so that child can visualize the components of the inference. Which pieces of this text am I having to use and connect up to make this inference? And which bits am I having to supply from my own head to understand what's going on in this text? So I think that's a great question. And some of these interventions, like the flexibility intervention, for example, might be provided if you're doing a multi-level tiered system for intervention. If you find a child who has that tunnel vision and they're only focusing on decoding with no attention to meaning, then perhaps they need, as a tier 2 intervention or even tier 3, that explicit focus on helping them to shift and become more flexible and pull away from those decoding processes to incorporate meaning. You provide that intervention, but then take them quickly back into text and see if this intervention has helped to improve their flexible attention to meaning when reading real text. Always intervene and teach with real text. That's, I think, executive function intervention is not separate, if that makes sense. It's a great question.
No, that's a good point. That's a really good point. So Brian asks, what assessments would you recommend to determine underlying skill difficulties that may be impacting reading comprehension skill development?
That's a hard question to answer, because I think that we have far fewer reading comprehension subcomponent assessments than we do word recognition assessments. We know how to assess phonemic awareness and phonics knowledge and so on and so forth, but it's difficult. We don't have an inference making assessment, for example. It's more of your clinical skills as an educator, watching a student who's not making those inferences, watching a student who is unable to retell a story. And I think this is a place where the field, where the researchers need to come together to develop assessments that practitioners can use in the classroom to figure out, is it inferencing, is it monitoring, and is it flexibility, and so forth. And so I don't have a good, clean answer for that one, but your clinical skills can help you determine some of these things. And then working with your school psychologist, they have executive function assessments. And you may even be familiar in a child study meeting with a school psychologist saying, student A here has executive function weaknesses. Well, now after today's presentation, you may better understand how that would play out in specific reading difficulties.
Call on the people who are there to support you and to support the students. I think that's great advice. I really liked what you said about being transparent in your thinking and very explicit with your instruction. I think that really, I think back to my teaching days, which was many years ago. And I think I did a lot of that with my students, not knowing that that's what I should be doing. But I remember clearly that it was really helpful to them to have them get in my head and read, think about the thoughts that I had as I was being a reader, a proficient reader. We have a comment here from Brian, who was asking about the assessments. I found the brief to be a good assessment of executive function skills, and it might be interesting to correlate results with reading assessments.
Absolutely. The brief, if you're not familiar with the brief, it is It's an executive function assessment that's like a teacher report or parent report. You can have teachers and parents both report and fill this out. And it looks at everyday behaviors of a student. Are they organized in their work, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't have questions specific to reading, but it has questions specific to everyday life where you might be able to identify executive function difficulties, and that may give you insight into how those are playing out in reading processes. So that's a great one if your school or school psychologist has access to the brief. There's another text on the market. Dawson and Guare have a text called Executive Skills for Children and Adolescents, and that has a similar assessment at the back of the book that you can use as a free reproducible in your classroom to rate students in that way. Yeah, to identify kinds of weaknesses.
We have a few more minutes. I know that you are the past and current recipient of an IES research grant. Can you tell us a little bit about those two projects?
Sure, I would be delighted to. The project that we are just wrapping up, we just finished with this project, but we're still writing things up for publication. You know how that may go, but that was a project investigating the role of executive function skills and language skills and word recognition skills in the development of reading comprehension for English monolingual students, but also emergent bilingual students. And these were predominantly Spanish speakers, close to 90% of emergent bilingual students were Spanish speakers in addition to English. And what we're finding is that those executive function skills do contribute through that overlap between word reading and language comprehension. In other words, executive function skills help readers to coordinate all the many, many, many things that we need to coordinate to be good readers. And we are currently working on the 4-year data, well, I guess it was 3-year data points across this 3-year period. We're working on the longitudinal piece for that. And we have another project that we're working on now that's IES funded, focusing on these same kinds of contributors to reading comprehension in dual language immersion settings. There's some evidence that shows that learning 2 languages helps you to have stronger executive function skills that you can then leverage in literacy tasks, which is a wonderful thing for those of us who love literacy and language. So do I hear another question? I heard a ping. I guess not.
No, I think that was just a time warning.
Got it. Okay. And then I'm consulting on another IES funded project looking at flexibility in word reading, because we know that readers need to be flexible. I think of the example of the struggling reader, the below basic reader we heard yesterday in Commissioner Carr's presentation. They read the word. We were talking about some animals and their habitat, and they read the word L-I-V-E as live. The animal, where does it live, right? And the more proficient child read it correctly as live. Being able to be flexible about the pronunciation for the meaningful context is something that we do automatically as a good reader, but somebody who struggles doesn't do that. And so that's one way that might play out.
Interesting. We do have one more question. How can a reading interventionist help the general ed teacher to complete each other's work, not to work in 2 isolated islands?
Oh, wow. That's tough. And I think being guided by the student's data, looking back to the data chart I shared at the beginning of the talk today, if you know, and you and the teacher have conversed and commiserated, perhaps looking at where the child is struggling, you can, as a classroom teacher, notice from your classroom data, whether it's incidental data in the child's work and retellings and whatnot in class, but you can use assessments as well as an interventionist so that you can tackle the places where that teacher notices the child is struggling based on data. Always, we should use a data-driven approach. We're not just working completely separately.
I think that's another piece of good advice. Before we wrap up completely, I want to thank you again for your presentation, which was very interesting and thought-provoking, and I'm sure everyone got a lot out of it. We do have some resources available, as Dr. Cartwright had mentioned, so we encourage you to take a look at those. and enjoy what's left of the conference today. The next round of sessions is at 2:20, so you have about 6 minutes before that comes up. And don't forget to attend the closing plenary at 3:15. And of course, go back to the recordings, which I see are being posted continuously, because there are a lot of sessions all competing at the same time. And I think there's a lot of valuable information to be gleaned from all of the great presenters we've had during this IES Reading Summit. So thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.